In this lecture, we're going to cover the basic ecological challenges that all animals face and how that is going to really form the blueprint of how this course is going to be run. So we're going to talk about the morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations animals evolve relative to their ecological challenges. And then we'll also talk about how we'll be tracking these things from a phylogenetic perspective. Welcome to Biology 2371, Animal Form and Function. This course is basically going to be a study of zoology. And zoology is the study of animal life. And we're really going to focus this class on looking at the ecological challenges that all animals face and how they've evolved morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations to meet those challenges. So, for example, one of the things that all animals have to do if they're going to break down their food and use aerobic metabolism is they have to take up oxygen, because oxygen is a critical part of that pathway. And there are various challenges that aquatic organisms versus terrestrial organisms have in absorbing oxygen. So here are some of the adaptations that we see in aquatic organisms on the left. So we have large surface area where you have underneath these false leg-like structures, we have a high degree of vascularization. And so those large surface areas can help to increase the oxygen absorption and also getting rid of CO2. A lot of animals that live in the aquatic environment have gills, and you're familiar with gills in things like fish, but those can also be seen in bivalve mollusks like oysters and clams. Some of the worms also have gills that are extensions of their body. Some animals, however, are just simply very flat. And when you have a flat body, you have a relatively high surface area to volume ratio, and so you can simply absorb oxygen across your skin. Now, once you get into the terrestrial environment, there are certain opportunities about absorbing oxygen. There's a lot more oxygen in air than there is in water. But a respiratory surface doesn't work if it dries out. So when you get into the terrestrial environment, we'll see that we have the evolution of internalizing our respiratory surfaces so that you can keep them moist. And so we know that in lungs, in vertebrates, but there are other organisms that have done similar things, analogous things. So we see some of the terrestrial slugs and snails have little breathing holes in the side of their body that lead into a lung cavity. So that's just an example of some of these ecological challenges and examples of adaptations that animals have evolved to meet those challenges. But just talking about those types of traits and their function doesn't make a lot of sense in biological terms unless you put it into an evolutionary perspective. So we're going to be using phylogenies to understand both the evolution of the diversity of different organisms. So understanding the major lineages, and you'll be seeing this figure a lot. This is the phylogeny of some of the major lineages of animals. So what makes a deuterostome versus a protostome? What are some of the evolutionary traits associated with each of these, and how have these traits evolved up these branches in the phylogenetic tree? So we're going to be tracking that in large part during this semester. One of the things we'll also be tracking is the evolution of basic body types. Some of the earliest animals we'll talk about are very simple animals that don't even have true germ tissues, like sponges. And then we'll see some of the earlier lineages post-sponges, probably post-sponges. There's some debate on that we'll talk about, have two basic germ levels. And so we call these two types of tissues in these animals. We call these animals diploblastic animals. So they have endoderm and ectoderm, we'll see. A little bit later, but evolving pretty early also in the animal phylogeny, we'll see the evolution of triploblastic animals that have endoderm and ectoderm, but sandwiched in between that, they have mesoderm. But exactly how that mesoderm forms and the patterns of cleavage will help us distinguish two major groups like spiral cleavage versus radial cleavage, is one of the key things that will help us determine these two different groups called the protostomes and the deuterostomes. So we'll be tracking all these things from an evolutionary or phylogenetic perspective as we're tracking the various morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations seen in different groups of animals. Let's spend a little bit more time talking about these key challenges that all animals face. The first thing is just distinguishing the inside of your body from the outside and getting that protection from that external environment. The structures associated with defining the outside of your body are the integument. So it's the skin and the associated structures. So we'll be talking about the skin and how it differs from various invertebrates and vertebrates, and some of the characteristic associated traits that grow from the skin include things like hair. But true hair only exists in mammals. We'll see that there are other animals that have hair-like structures, like flies. Scales, there are various forms of scales that can be seen in a variety of organisms, and we'll talk about that. Feathers are seen in some dinosaurs and their descendants, the birds. And then hard shells are part of the structures formed by the integument of some organisms. And that it also includes the exoskeleton of things like crabs and spiders and insects, the arthropods. Another challenge that all animals face is they have to eat. They somehow have to get the energy to keep them alive. So food acquisition and then subsequent digestion of that food is very important. And most animals have an alimentary system or a digestive tract. And that starts with various forms of capturing the food and maybe subduing the food if you're a predator. But then we'll see that there's actually a lot of similarities in the alimentary tract between a variety of organisms like vertebrates and insects. They all have to take that food and move it through the body where they break it down both chemically and mechanically, and then we have to have an absorption area where it's absorbing those food products. And then eventually, obviously, you've got to get rid of those food wastes. But once you've broken that food down into its smaller molecular components, then we have to actually turn that into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the most efficient way of doing that is through aerobic metabolism. We'll quickly review the difference between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. But aerobic is far more efficient. You're getting more ATP with the same beginning molecule like glucose compared to anaerobic metabolism. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to have aerobic metabolism, you've got to have oxygen. And so we've already kind of covered this, the challenges of getting oxygen in terrestrial versus aquatic organisms and the various adaptations that they have. So we'll talk about that. But once you get that oxygen in your system, then you have to move that oxygen and those nutrients that you got from your alimentary system by breaking it down, and then also subsequently the waste products from the metabolic processes. You got to move those around the body to the appropriate locations, and that is going to require a circulatory system in many organisms. Again, some of the simplest animals we'll talk about, they don't have a circulatory system. However, they can simply accomplish all of these means, in at least many of them, just through diffusion through their thin, small bodies. But we'll track how that varies in different animal groups. When we get to the circulatory system, we'll see that in complex organisms, there are two major ways of doing that. A lot of organisms have a closed circulatory system like us and an earthworm. The most prominent animals on the planet, however, have an open circulatory system, and we'll talk about how they can get away with that. So we talked about the alimentary system producing solid waste from undigested food products. But there's another important kind of waste that the body creates, and that's from the breakdown of proteins and other nitrogen-bearing molecules. We got to get rid of that nitrogenous waste. But in the process of doing that, concentrating the nitrogenous waste, usually with a minimal amount of water or an appropriate amount of water, depending on the water demands placed on the animal living in aquatic versus terrestrial environment, and a saltwater versus a freshwater environment. We'll talk about those effects. But at the same time you're getting rid of these nitrogenous wastes, there's certain things that you want to keep, like you sometimes want to keep some of that water, and sometimes you want to keep sugars and salts that are also embedded within your bloodstream. And so we'll talk about the excretory structures that are important in doing that. And there's a huge range of excretory structures that have evolved in different animal groups. So in us, it's the kidney. That's what's seen in vertebrates. And most arthropods primarily use what is called a Malpighian tubule system. A very different system from the kidney system, but it's accomplishing the same task. Most animals move, and so for movement you need support of the body, and so we'll talk about different skeletal systems, including an internal endoskeletal system like we see in vertebrates, but a lot of animals have an external or exoskeletal system. But connected to these skeletal systems provide basic support, but they also provide attachment of muscles, and the muscles, the complexity and the types of muscle fibers can vary from animal group to animal group, but the muscle fiber physiology and basic anatomy is very similar. The different muscle fiber types seen in a wide range of animals, as we'll see. And as I mentioned, a lot of animals do move, not all of them, but they do move in pursuit of prey or to try to escape being a prey item for a predator. And to do that, you have to have a nervous system. So you have to be able to sense what the environment is around you, and you can do that by sight. So having photosensory structures or structures that sense gravity and the direction of movement, or taste and smell reception, so chemoreception. We'll talk about the diversity of these sensory structures that have evolved in animals. But it all boils down to connection of different cells in the body, from the sensory structures to, in some cases, a brain-like structure through a series of neurons. And we'll talk about the basic neuron or nerve cell architecture and functioning. Another challenge that animals face is trying to maintain a temperature that is most appropriate for the biochemical reactions that occur within the body. So animals try to regulate their temperature, and they have a greater or lesser ability to do that metabolically. So animals that are endotherms have the capability of metabolically generating heat, and they have mechanisms of keeping that heat in the body, or if they get too hot, of shedding some of that heat. And so we'll talk about the thermoregulatory capabilities of animals that are endotherms. Now, an ectotherm, they just don't have typically the metabolic capacity of generating that heat that might be a higher heat that is allowing for more efficient breakdown of food and neural transmissions. But we'll see that even ectotherms can maintain their body temperature to some degree if they just move around in the environment to appropriate habitats that are that temperature. And all that an animal does means nothing from an evolutionary point of view if it doesn't pass on its genes. And so that's going to be a big topic in this class, is animal mating and reproductive tactics. And we'll talk about a lot of animals that have sexual reproduction of both male and female individuals, but we'll see that quite a few animals have both male and female reproductive capabilities within a single individual. And so they don't have to find an individual of the opposite sex to mate with. They just have to find an individual of their species. And we'll talk about the pros and cons, the benefits and some of the costs associated with each of these mating strategies. And then once fertilization has taken place, we'll talk about how development changes, going from cleavage to blastulation and the formation of organs and larval forms in different animal groups. And we'll see that for a lot of animals, juvenile dispersal is a very important aspect of their life history. It's a very important stage in their life, because we'll see that while some animals move a lot, some animals don't. But regardless, it's usually not a very good idea to mature in the same area as your closest relatives, because you end up competing with them. You could end up mating with them, and inbreeding is in generally not a good idea. As we'll talk about, there's some genetic problems with that. So we'll talk about the different mechanisms by which organisms disperse as juveniles before they develop into adults. Okay, so again, this class is going to look at the ecological challenges that all animals face and the morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations that they have evolved to meet those challenges. But to do that, it only makes sense to track these things from an evolutionary point of view, and so we have to understand the evolutionary relatedness of the major groups of animals. And again, we'll track their basic body types and the patterns of evolution of these key adaptations. Okay, so that's an introduction to what we're going to be covering in the course. The next video is going to cover adaptive evolution.